Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking your standard vocabulary lesson and, well, we're completely elevating it. We're diving into a college-level academic analysis of conflict idioms. We aren't just going to sit here and memorize a list of phrases. Instead, we're going to look really closely at the semantics and pragmatics of these expressions. We're focusing on exactly when, where, and how to use them effectively in both your professional and everyday life.
Let's kick things off with a pretty profound thought from Ronald Reagan. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. We're starting here to establish a fundamental truth, which is that human disagreement, it's completely inevitable. But how we use language to navigate that friction, that is what truly matters. Our vocabulary literally dictates our ability to manage, de-escalate, or simply survive disputes.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll explore the entire life cycle of a dispute across 5 specific semantic categories: the nature of conflict, division and disagreement, feelings and pressures, aggression and hostility, and finally, resolution and composure.
This cycle is basically our roadmap for the day. You see, we're not just looking at a random assortment of words. We're tracking how a conflict, and the exact language we use to describe it, evolves. We move from this ambient tension in the environment to a sudden spark, right into intense internal psychological pressure, out into an external clash, and finally, hopefully, to a peaceful aftermath.
All right, let's jump right into Phase 1, the nature of conflict, focusing on the ambient environment.
Think of conflict at this stage like a cracked stone landscape brewing under dark, heavy clouds. It's a striking metaphor, right? Because at this point, it's not actually about two people yelling at each other in a boardroom. It's about the foundational conditions, the atmosphere itself, that makes an argument likely to happen in the first place.
So the crucial point here is really grasping what we call ambient idioms. Take mounting unrest, for example. You'd use this to describe a growing societal tension or widespread public dissatisfaction, the exact kind of atmosphere where a strike or a protest might suddenly break out in your organization. Then you've got a burning issue, which is a problem so urgent it demands your immediate attention. We also see phrases like cutthroat competition to describe a truly ruthless environment with zero ethical constraints, or an insurmountable problem for a challenge that just feels fundamentally impossible to overcome.
Moving right along to Phase 2, this is division and disagreement, which we can think of as the spark.
At this point in the cycle, the conflict operates like a sudden, sharp fracture. Imagine a solid block of stone that just suddenly cracks. It creates these highly visible breaks between individuals, groups, or institutions that used to be completely stable and united. The crack has officially formed. To talk about this fracture, we rely on a very specific set of idioms. Like, you've probably heard the phrase, to drive a wedge. We use that to describe the act of causing hostility between allies, kind of like how a leaked memo might drive a wedge between two negotiating parties. Or you might say someone is trying to stir things up when they purposely inject tension into a situation that had just achieved a fragile peace. And on a more everyday level, when two people just fundamentally disagree on a strategy, we simply say they do not see eye to eye.
Now, take a step back and notice how this actually builds into an escalation ladder. It's pretty fascinating. We escalate both pragmatically and semantically. We start all the way up at the broad societal level with mounting unrest. Then we narrow down to interpersonal sabotage by someone driving a wedge. And if that's left totally unchecked, it eventually erupts into direct, physical, or severe confrontation, which we call coming to blows.
Okay, that brings us to Phase 3, feelings and pressures, focusing on internal states.
Because, conflict absolutely isn't just about what's happening on the outside. Imagine a heated, glowing metal coil. That is a perfect way to visualize the intense, sustained psychological pressure that builds up inside a person right before they snap.
When we talk about this internal pressure, we use idioms that really capture that sense of constraint and extreme discomfort. For instance, being in a state of turmoil perfectly captures acute anxiety and confusion. Picture an entire department completely unsure of its future after a collapsed merger. Or how about breathing down someone's neck? That's when someone applies intense, unyielding, close observation that just leaves you feeling incredibly pressured. And if you hold on to all that resentment long term, well then, you bear a grudge.
But what happens when that immense internal pressure finally releases? Well, you might vent your spleen. And I absolutely love the history behind this one. It actually traces all the way back to medieval medicine, specifically humorism. Back in the day, the spleen was believed to literally produce black bile, the bodily fluid they associated with melancholy and fierce anger. So to vent your spleen meant to physically expel that fierce built-up rage out into the open.
Which naturally leads us to Phase 4, aggression and hostility, the external clash. Let's pause and look at the nuance between two phrases that sound super similar but are actually quite different. Itching for a fight implies a restless, internal eagerness to argue, like you can just tell someone is impatient and wants to clash, whereas picking a fight is the deliberate external act of starting the conflict. It's like purposely challenging a colleague's authority just to spark a quarrel.
So, the absolutely crucial takeaway in Phase 4 is pragmatic awareness. If you map these idioms out based on their level of formality and the exact nature of the dispute, you start to see why knowing your audience is everything. If you choose the wrong phrase for the setting, you risk severely damaging your professional register.
To give you an example, if you're in a super casual setting, you might use the highly informal phrase, "have a scrap," to describe a quick verbal quarrel between folks in a hallway. But if you need to describe severe mutual hostility where literally all civility has been abandoned, say between two rival corporate departments, you'd step it up and say they are at each other's throats.
On the flip side of that, if you're in a highly formal or academic setting, you definitely wouldn't say the scholars had a scrap, right? Instead, you'd elevate the language and say the two linguists crossed swords over a theoretical debate. It implies a calculated duel of wits, rather than just a chaotic brawl.
Finally, we make it through the clash and arrive at Phase 5, resolution and composure, the aftermath. Think of the soothing image of stacked Zen stones sitting peacefully on calm water. It is the perfect counter to the cracked earth and those glowing, tense metal coils we talked about earlier. It reminds us that the ultimate goal of all this negotiation and linguistic framing is restoring peaceful, balanced relations. In this phase, your vocabulary fundamentally shifts toward healing. Say you're in the middle of a really tough mediation. You might need to keep a stiff upper lip, which just means concealing your emotions and maintaining a measured composure. Afterwards, you might sit down to clear the air to resolve any underlying misunderstandings, which then allows you to patch up your differences and actually preserve the working relationship.
And when everyone decides it's time to completely end hostilities and become true allies again, you bury the hatchet. Much like venting your spleen, this phrase has a totally fascinating origin. It comes directly from a peacemaking tradition among the indigenous peoples of North America, where chiefs would literally bury their physical weapons in the dirt to signify the definitive, lasting end of a conflict.
So I want to leave you with a question to chew on today. If, as Ronald Reagan suggested at the start, mastering conflict is all about handling it gracefully, then you absolutely need the right language for every single phase of the cycle, from identifying mounting unrest to maintaining a stiff upper lip, all the way to burying the hatchet. So which stage of your own conflict vocabulary are you going to refine first? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.